Thanks very much, Christian. Thanks very much, everybody. As I was putting these slides together over the past couple of weeks, everywhere I looked, there was yet more commentary appearing about piracy. So whether that was Outsell reminding us that the Pirate Bay of Science, as in Sci-Hub, was holding subscription models under siege with 85% of closed access journal articles ever published in its illegal possession, or one of our friends in the open science world opening a discussion of what stealing actually means in the context of platforms such as Sci-Hub or academic literature. Or, very interestingly, quite recently last week, a letter from the German Startups Association to MEPs suggesting that German investors would not invest in online platforms if copyright laws were tightened and startups were held liable for copyright infringement, as well as some good old-fashioned publisher bashing from the Electronic Frontier Foundation. I'm not quite clear what they're trying to say here about copyright and censorship, but I'm sure it's quite interesting. Most of this kind of commentary is based on the idea, and I think it comes from Kevin Kelly, that the internet is a copy machine, and that there's therefore no point in doing anything about it, in trying to stop copying, because it just happens. The content industries don't understand the reality of the tech world. Once anything that can be copied is brought into contact with the internet, it will be copied, and those copies never leave. Even a dog knows you can't erase something once it's flowed on the internet. And like many of you, I was sent a PDF of the Michael Wolff book about a week before it was published in PDF form, obviously flowing around the internet. But don't worry, I bought a copy because I'm a good publisher. But if everything can be copied and distributed so easily, what does that mean for how we think about piracy and how we respond to piracy? And how do we actually define piracy? You could say defining piracy is easy and as difficult as Potter Stewart's trying to define pornography. So in a Supreme Court judgment in 1964, he says he's not going to attempt to define it, but I know it when I see it. And this definition from 1971, I think, is even better. In other words, piracy is almost anything that the producer of copyright work says they need to be protected from, which I quite like. I think maybe we should adopt this one. I don't think it would fly these days. But I think provisionally we might want to say that piracy is the commercial violation of legally sanctioned intellectual property. It's a symptom of unmet user needs and market demand to some extent. And I think it's also an exploitation of the gap between price and value. Now, if we take a slight step sideways into literary history, as a failed academic who once studied the 18th century, now a publisher, piracy has had a long and noble heritage, or ignoble heritage in literary history, both in terms of commercial exploitation and in response to market need. First publication of Hamlet was the Bad Quarto of 1603. This was based on an unauthorized memorial reconstruction of a performance of the play. And in this version, to be or not to be, the to be or not to be speech says, to be or not to be, there's the point. Not quite so much resonance as the version we know today. I did my PhD on Lawrence Stern's The Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy Gentleman. First volume came out in 1760. It was followed by hundreds of parodies, imitations, rip-offs, including a fake volume 3, which was published weeks before Stern's own volume 3 was published. And the same thing happened with volume 9 as well. So someone wrote an entirely fake volume and published it as the 3rd volume or as the 9th volume of Tristram Shandy. And the quotation here is from a spoof called The Life and Amours of Hafen, Slaukenbergius. Have you read all the volumes of Tristram Shandy? You understand them perfectly well, I suppose, all the ... And of course, later on, we've got New York author Kathy Acker, who turns piracy into a creative act by plagiarizing Harold Robbins' bestseller, The Pirate, essentially just copying half of it into one of her early novels. But returning to the world of academic publishing, what really interests me here are less the traditional piracy cases that come up regularly, the kind of things that come before the STM Enforcement Task Force, where, as in the Potter Stewart definition, you know it immediately, you see it. But I'm interested in the less clear-cut examples, especially where we're talking about changing market dynamics and technological capacity. So, for example, a case that came up that Wiley was involved with where was Kurtzsang against John Wiley and Sons, Supreme Court case, which we actually lost, which is a textbook example of pricing arbitrage. So Kurtzsang was, I think he was a Malaysian or Indonesian student in the US who was essentially importing lower priced textbooks that were intended for developing markets into the United States. And we took them to court, and essentially we lost because the first sale doctrine was judged to apply to copies of copyrighted works lawfully made and acquired abroad. So essentially, lower priced developing market textbooks can be brought into a first world market and be sold at lower prices. Google Books. I've been fascinated by where things have gone with Google Books. Not that I'm saying Google Books is necessarily piracy, but I think it raises some very, very interesting questions about what we think of as copying and as transformative use. So if you look at the appeal judgment, this is the top one, this is the appeal judgment in the Authors Guild case against Google. The judgment here is that because the purpose of copying is highly transformative, essentially transformative use, fair use, trumps copyright. Despite the commercial nature and profit motivation of Google's use, because Google Books is transformative, it trumps copyright. The Authors Guild, of course, went back, and then the substantial question of their appeal, which again failed, was because Google Books essentially copies, is that use actually transformative enough? So I think, again, we have a question here about what is copying, what should be allowed, what kinds of use are fair or non-piratical uses in the context of copying copyright-protected material. And the last example I want to raise here is some of the discussions going on in the digital single market around innovation. Now, as many of you probably know, there's been a huge amount of discussion about text and data mining and about whether a copyright exception should be implemented in Europe. Of course, most publishers don't have a problem with this for academic uses, but we've seen a lot of backwards and forwards, especially in the in the deliberations in the various parliamentary committees. And so Teresa Comodini-Caccia, who was the rapporteur for the jury committee, was very clear that she wanted to extend access for text and data mining even to organisations that did not have lawful access to work. So essentially her report would suggest there was going to be an obligation on rights holders to provide copies to people who hadn't even subscribed to content solely for the purpose of text and data mining. Now that seems to have gone by the by because Comodini-Caccia has left, is no longer an MEP, there's a different rapporteur on the committee, but I think we're seeing similar language around innovation, around enabling text and data mining, which is kind of extending the idea of what copyright protection should or should not allow, and really makes us think about what it means to be copying and to be pirating material. This last piece on the right is from the Allied for Startups call for an innovation exception to protect European startups against any form of copyright infringement. So giving them protection against infringement because, of course, startups are so innovative, exceptions cannot accommodate the new use cases we find and we explore every day. We need a flexible and open-ended exception based on international norms which can allow us to experiment without harming rights holders. So again, how do we enable innovation, but how do we make sure that we're not enabling piracy, we're not enabling duplication? Where do we see this kind of thing going in Europe? And I think it's really clear that things are changing and developing all the time. And as an industry, we absolutely need to rise to the challenge of piracy as it is now and as it will be in the future. And as market needs, market dynamics, technologies change, how do we as a publishing industry respond? How do we identify and manage what I define as the commercial violation of legally sanctioned intellectual property? Especially, how do we better understand unmet user needs and market demand? And also, I think, in the context of Sci-Hub, how do we as an industry answer the question, what does it mean to be a publisher if everything we publish is effectively available for free? Thank you.